Hello everyone, welcome to the virtual event organized by Wakamolevi Memorial and Research Center. Today's special lecture on women and Italian fascism would be delivered by Dr. Anne Wingenter. Dr. Anne is currently working as a professor of history and women's studies and an acting associate dean of academic affairs at Loyola University Chicago's John Felix Rome Center. Her PhD thesis titled A Study of War Mothers and Widows in Fascist Italy was awarded the Society of Italian Historical Studies Dissertation Prize for that year. Her research interests include gender and women history, fascist movements, the politics of history, the history and literature of travel, the history of imperialism, etc. Her recent publications include Benito Mussolini in Italian high school textbooks, Politics of Grief, War Widows and Mothers in Interwar Italy, The Crowd is a Woman, Remembering Italian Fascism, etc. Welcome, Dr. Anne, to the event.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Ramakrishnan would be the chair of today's event. Dr. Ramakrishnan needs no introduction. He's very much known to the circle of the MMRC members. Dr. Ramakrishnan is currently working as a professor at the Center for West Asian Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Earlier, he worked as a professor and director of the Center for West Asian Studies at Jamia Millia University, New Delhi. He also served as a director of the School of International Relations and Politics at Mahatma Gandhi University in Kerala. He was a distinguished international scholar at a number of international universities. He also worked as a visiting professor at universities in countries such as Spain, Lithuania, etc. He also delivered his papers in a number of international conferences. His teaching and research interests include West Asian studies, theories of international relations, gender, and post-colonialism, etc. He has published widely in English and Malayalam. Some of his articles and reviews have been published in reputed journals such as International Studies, Scandinavian Journal of Development Alternatives, and Millennium, Journal of International Studies, Contemporary South Asia, and International Cultural Studies, etc. Welcome, Dr. Ramakrishnan, to the event. We all understand that wars create long-lasting impact on the lives of citizens. But we probably don't know how it impacts the life of women, that too during the war and post-war. So we hope that through the discussion today, we would get to understand the suffering of women during the war and post-war. And we look forward to this as a reference and to suggest it as a reference to anyone who's interested to know about the effects of war, especially on women. And we also hope that today's session would become an eye-opener for those who support fascist and militancy movements. Over to Dr. Ramakrishnan.
Thank you, Dr. Shahina, for that generous introduction. I'm extremely happy once again to be part of Wakamolevi Center's programs because I'm part and parcel of it, and I'm very happy to share our thoughts and basically to hear Dr. Anne Wingenter. I don't know whether I pronounced her last name properly or not, but we are here to hear you, Dr. Anne, and I need not talk very much as an introduction because the linkages between the politics of fascism and politics of gender in general and politics of women in particular, that linkage is a complex one, as we all know. It's not a straightforward relationship where women oppose fascism, etc., by nature or anything of that sort. We have seen fascists mobilize women in a large number across human history. The extreme right wing in modern times have done that in a big manner. But at the same time, you have tremendous resistance to fascism from women's groups, movements, feminist organizations in particular, and the coalition of progressive elements in society against the assertion of fascist values in whichever society they live. But fascism proper, the Italian fascism, is the topic of discussion today. Like how Machiavelli is utilized in Italian politics by Mussolini himself to legitimize his authoritarian fascist regime. But at the same time, revolutionary figures like Antonio Gramsci, spending time in Mussolini's jail, was also reflecting on Machiavelli for entirely different purposes. In a similar manner, when we discuss women with respect to fascist ideologies, there is that possibility of, on the one hand, providing certain kind of agency for people in general and women in particular by extreme right-wing ideologies, so that there is some kind of newer identity being created for them. At the same time, we have the questioning of these kinds of hegemonic activities, discourses, mobilizations, etc., by people who critically look at societies. And women's organizations have done that. Feminist thought in general have done that. When I started looking at the feminist movements from Italy, I was struck by works of many people, but in the 60s and 70s, in the 70s in particular, it was Maria Rosa della Costa, socialist feminists of that stage who mobilized women, discussed about women's labor in a big manner, and provided us with a lot of insights on how to move away from right-wing ideologies to more liberatory processes. So the Italian case, both the fascist phase and its revolutionary history, is very illuminating, and I hope we will have a meaningful discussion today, and we all look forward to hearing you, Dr. and Wingenter. I am very happy to invite you to speak. Thank you. You have to unmute, I think. Unmute.
Has to unmute me. Okay, sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself. I'm just going to share my screen with you because I have some slides that I'd like to share just to support the lecture. Okay, so good evening to everyone. Buonasera. As you've heard, my name is Anne Wingenter, and I'm a professor of history and women's studies at Loyola University's John Felice Rome Center. I am honored and delighted to be here to speak to you about a subject that's really been kind of at the center of my research and teaching for many years. First, I'd like to thank the Vakam Molavi Center for hosting Professor Sethi of the Inter-University Center for Social Science Research and Extension for inviting me. my dear friends and collaborators, Abdelatif Chalikandi and Dr. Sabrina Lay, for making this connection for me from the Tawassul Europe Center for Dialogue. Dr. Ramakrishnan for chairing, and also for that introduction, which I think did a wonderful job of setting up just how complex a subject this is that I hope to scratch the surface of, and scratch the surface of in a way that leaves us some food for thought. Thank you all for attending as well. I'm really happy to have this exchange with colleagues in India, and I'm looking forward to learning from your perspectives on this subject. So to start, I'd like to just give you kind of a brief roadmap of what I want to cover tonight. So part one is going to give you a brief intro and timeline of Italian fascism, which we'll run through very quickly, but hopefully will help us kind of ground what we're talking about in a bit of a framework. Part two, which is what I'll spend most of my time on, is a look at fascist gender politics. And then part three, I'll suggest some lessons for today, which hopefully will come out a little bit in the Q&A. And also over the course of the lecture too, I'll try to point out places that our conversation might take off from. So something really important to understand from the beginning is that fascism was invented in Italy, right? Mussolini was the first fascist. So when we talk about historical Italian fascism, we're talking about a phenomenon, a movement, an ideology that was making itself up as it went along, right? And for this reason, it's a very complex subject to study, because fascism is different things at different times. Sometimes it's different things at the same time, depending on who the interlocutors are. And for this reason, I think too, it's one of the things that makes historical fascism attractive to alt-right and ultranationalist groups as a model. They find aspects of it from different periods that they can kind of hinge their own ideologies on, and especially tactics taken from early fascist movements that are adaptable to different situations. I want to point out that some brief kind of points in the timeline that I think are important to recognize. Fascism was founded in Italy in 1919, just a few months after the end of the First World War. Between 1919 and 1922, when we talk about fascism, what we're talking about is a movement outside of parliamentary politics that was seeking the revolutionary acquisition of power. It had sort of two wings, a kind of paramilitary wing and a political wing, both of which sought to exploit the tensions and political weaknesses that were caused by the First World War, and also by the Bolshevik Revolution just a couple of years earlier. I would argue that Italian fascism is also a response to a longer term, what I call a crisis of masculinity, which is something that maybe we can cover in the Q&A if we have time, but I just wanted to put it out there. The paramilitary part of the party engaged in violent attacks on the opposition. In fact, the photograph that you're looking at is the burning down of a socialist newspaper office in Rome in 1920 by fascist squads. This violence included the murder of large numbers of people and other forms of physical intimidation as well. At the same time, there was a political strategy led primarily, but not exclusively, by Mussolini and his newspaper that sought to present the fascists as a partner to embattled traditional elites. So traditional institutions of power in Italy, the monarchy, conservative parties in parliament, who were struggling with the sort of post-war chaos, but also with adjusting to modernity and to mass politics, right? And so the fascists in these early years kind of pursued a dual path to power. Those early years, fascism is primarily a masculine phenomenon. It deliberately seeks to appeal to veterans and to youth who would like to have been veterans. Not a lot of women directly involved in the squads. In fact, the photograph on the upper left here that has a woman in it, I could tell you her name. There's so few of them that I could tell you the names of the women involved in squadrism in this era. And so it's not going to be this early period is not going to be my main focus, because it's also a period in which the fascists don't really have a particular gender politics beyond this kind of exaltation of the warrior ethos. That will change in 1922 when Mussolini is appointed prime minister. So when Mussolini and as the head of the fascist party comes to power in Italy. It's important to emphasize here that Mussolini comes to power in a constitutional fashion. He's made prime minister the same way every other Italian prime minister to that time had been prime minister. He was appointed by the king. This is, obviously happening in a context of violence and a strategy of tension in the countryside. But this is, something to think about also when we think about alt-right and militant nationalist movements today. What we have is the use of constitutional politics, of the institutions of liberal democratic politics at the time, to achieve power, and then once in power, the undermining of those institutions, the dismantling of them, the perversion of them, the eradication of them. And we start to see that very early on during Mussolini's prime ministership, right, premiership, and so that we can start to talk about a transition out of a parliamentary, multi-party parliamentary system and to a single-party dictatorship, starting late 1924, 1925, and in place within a few years. This is accompanied by an erosion of individual rights, legislation that specifically undermines the institutions which had at that point been recognized in Italy as contingent on representative democracy. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press, separation of powers, all of those things. Another important date to keep in mind for our particular topic is that in 1929, the Italian state, the Italian fascist state, signs a treaty with the Vatican, a concordat, which regularizes church-state relations in Italy, which for historical reasons had been, the church and the state had not recognized each other from Italian unification to this point. The fact that this concordat had been achieved under the rule of fascism lent a kind of veneer of respectability to the fascist regime, helped people forget about both the violence that brought the fascists onto the scene and also the continued use of violence during the regime. Many are sort of placated by this. The church, the Catholic Church and the fascist regime are not sort of in complete agreement on everything by any means at all, but one area where they do find common cause is in their gender politics. And this will kind of help lend weight to some of the approaches that the fascist government will take. Another date to keep in mind that I'll talk about sort of at the end of this section is 1935 with the invasion of Ethiopia, the extension, the creation of Mussolini's new Roman Empire. This is a period which will see the beginnings of the full-hearted embrace of a racialized definition of what a nation is. And it also will put Italy on a war footing that it won't leave until 1945. So Italy will be either mobilized for or at war for the entire period between 1935 and 1945. An overview of some defining characteristics also to keep in mind to be applied to gender, and then also maybe in our conversation about lessons for today. One of the things that is a kind of through line of fascism from the movement even into the regime is this carryover of wartime categories and rhetoric into domestic politics. And so there is a kind of mobilization that, so the fascists themselves, those squadrists that we see here, the kind of story that they tell about themselves is that, they had come back from fighting an external enemy in the First World War. They came back to a country and found an internal enemy or enemies, because the internal enemy was sort of whoever they decided to identify as the internal enemy, and brought that battle home. This throughout the regime, this is a kind of through line, and it's accompanied with constant claims of victimization, right? And a justification of violence to be used against internal enemies. And this is a characteristic that I think we find, again, today, if I can just interject that here, this kind of justification of the use of violence because we are the real victims, right? Fascism is characterized by a palingenetic nationalism, which means a nationalism which seeks through some kind of historic mission to restore glory. For the fascists, it was, the model was the Roman Empire. Mussolini saw himself as a kind of new Augustus, and the desire to create a new Roman Empire was very much part of the fascist propaganda and mythos. And this is presented as a resolution to an existential crisis, right? There is this evocation constantly of an existential crisis. This goes together hand in hand, obviously, with the claims of victimization. The resolution of this existential crisis will require violence. This violence will be targeted at vulnerable populations, identifiable minorities. The violence is to be directed and wielded by a strong man, in our case, Benito Mussolini, who you see in the photograph here. And the management of this requires at least the illusion, the impression of a direct contact with the masses. So the photograph is actually not a photograph, it's a film still of one of Mussolini's speeches from the infamous balcony in Piazza Venezia. And you can see in front of him microphones. This is just a reminder to us of the importance of media and the importance of propaganda in the fascist period. The fascists they benefit from new technologies like film, sound film, like radio. People are able to hear their leader's voice, to see their leader's image on the silver screen in moving pictures, and there is a kind of reflected glow of celebrity that helps keep up this illusion of a kind of direct contact with the masses. And we might think about that today, about how sort of new media are used in similar ways by would-be or actual strongmen in our present time. Okay, that brings me to the kind of main focus of the talk, which is what role does gender politics play? What did the regime want from women? Why? How did women and girls experience life in the regime? What role did they play? Those are big questions, which we'll kind of scratch at the surface of, or I'll kind of scratch at the surface of. And the first of those questions are easier to answer than the later questions. That is, it's easier for us to know what the regime wanted from women and girls than it is, and the role that they wanted them to play, than it is for us to have a clear idea of their experience. And this is something that Dr. Ramakrishnan touched on in his introduction. I've kind of presented here, which is admittedly very simplified, but I think a good encapsulation of, if we had to sum up fascist gender politics in a single sentence and a single image, this is the image I'd choose, and this is the sentence I'd choose. The quote is from Benito Mussolini: "War is to man as maternity is to women." And the image is actually a World War I era postcard, which I think we can see becoming kind of the model for the gendered universe of Italian fascism. Again, we see the carrying over of that wartime rhetoric, but we also see a gendered universe populated entirely by soldiers and mothers, right? Or by boys who will become soldiers and girls who will become mothers of soldiers. The image shows, well, you can all see it, right? A young boy playing at soldier. The young girl is handing him victory orders. So she is both representing an actual young girl in her essentialized role as support for the male warrior, but she's also playing a symbolic role, the symbolic role of the motherland, of Mother Italy. And this, I think, really touches on, both the sort of experience of fascism for women, or at least the experience that fascism was trying to get out of Italian women, but also their symbolic importance in support of, or as representative of apparent mass support for the regime. The focus on motherhood was kind of at the center of most fascist policies directed at women, right? So part of that answer for what the regime wanted from Italian women. This newspaper headline, Numbers Mean Strength. This is about an article that is advertising the celebration of Mother and Child Day, which was a fascist holiday that was instituted in the 1920s. The picture of this adorable young child, probably just waving, but certainly meant to evoke the idea of this child, baby, really giving the fascist salute. It's another example of the kind of desire to have the Italians kind of internalize fascism as part of their Italian identity. And the quote underneath is from a speech that Mussolini gave to the Fasci Femminile, the first fascist women's organization delegation to Rome in 1927, when he tells them, go back home and tell the women that I need births, many births. Already here, we can start to see some of the contradictions faced by Italian women. That here we have an organization of fascist women going to Rome on an official delegation, sort of being exhorted to play their traditional role, even while they're participating in a very kind of modern activity, right? This organized encounter with the prime minister, with the duce, with the leader. The fascist policies that were designed to promote maternity were many, both sort of carrot and stick policies. So they, for example, would give marriage loans to young couples getting married, loans that would be forgiven with the birth of each successive child. Jobs and promotions for men were tied to being married and having a family. There was a bachelor tax placed on Italian men. There were education and employment quotas on Italian women, because studies at the time showed that educated women in the 1920s and 30s, working women in the 1920s and 30s, had fewer children than women who didn't work or who didn't have higher degrees. And so there was an attempt to restrict those opportunities for women. There was a criminalization of abortion and contraception. And there were these celebrations, like the Mother and Child Day indicated on the poster here at the left-hand side of the screen and in the previous slide. And also on Mother and Child Day, the women from each province of Italy who had the most live births would actually be given cash prizes by Mussolini himself, right? So sort of rewards for maternity. I think that it's important to think about this in terms of the kind of internal contradictions. I mean, there is, on the one hand, this promotion of the traditional role of wife and mother, but promoted in a way that makes this a kind of central duty to the state, not to the family, not to the individual, but to the state. And this is one of many contradictions that Italian women face in this period, because we have the promotion of traditional roles, which goes hand in hand with this assertion of women and their roles as being of national importance, right? And so for women themselves, there is this plethora of organizations now, all of which are kind of presented as kind of modern and liberating, but that are ultimately being promoted in the service of a kind of traditional role for women. So we have women being mobilized and brought into the public sphere to be told that their true duty to the state is in the private sphere, right? And so there is this kind of barrage of not necessarily contradictory messages. I mean, the message is straightforward, but the medium, the mobilization of it is in itself something new and experienced by many women we know from memoirs and from interviews as modernizing. So, you know, women who supported the regime often saw their support of the regime as something that gave them more importance than they had been previously given, that gave them a role to play in public. And even if that role was to go back home and tell women we need births, many births, it was nonetheless experienced by these women as creating a new space for them, right? And so when we think about resistance versus consent or resistance versus compliance, we have to remember that you know, those women who did support fascism supported fascism, seeing it as an opportunity for themselves, and that I think can help us understand in some ways the participation of women today in alt-right or ethno-nationalist organizations. Another contradiction was a more practical one, right? The promotion of maternity contrasted with the need for cheap labor. So even when the fascists did set labor quotas, the economy protested, right? Business owners, factory owners protested because women were universally paid less than men, and so there was never a sort of full respect of those quotas, and which the fascists themselves had to accommodate. All of this is underlain also with a kind of dualism that certainly the fascists themselves don't invent, but that they made much of during this period. Another quote from Mussolini here: "The women are angels or demons, born to take care of the household, bear children, and to make cuckolds." And so there is a kind of need, this idea that women and their bodies have to be controlled. They have to be explicitly policed by the family, by the state, in order to control their sexuality, for one thing, but also to make sure that they perform their duties. The cartoon with the title Cocktail juxtaposes a kind of robust peasant woman feeding her child with a caricature of what would have been recognized at the time as the new woman, right? In a, you know, thin, actually thin to the point of emaciation here, short hair, fashionable cocktail gown, but clearly like unhappy, unattractive. So this kind of juxtaposition reminds us that the fascists are operating in a period too where they have to compete with all kinds of models of femininity, of womanhood that are coming from the cinema, that are coming from the sort of wealthy Italian elites, and so they're constantly trying to promote a vision of womanhood that goes back to their kind of demographic goals. These kinds of these goals, I guess, were targeted from the beginning of one's life in fascist Italy. In other words, they began in childhood. You're looking at a school picture of a number of girls and boys, many of whom, not all, but most of whom are dressed in the uniform of the fascist youth. Notice how many of the girls are standing with their arms crossed, which is a direct imitation of Mussolini, one of Mussolini's sort of favorite positions, right? So kind of, it's not quite the fascist salute, but it is a disciplining of these children's bodies to represent their support, their innate fascistness. The schools would promote a certain way of being a good fascist Italian. This included the actual material they were learning in the schools. This is the first book of the fascist, and a sample from a kind of reading assignment from its interior. Benito Mussolini loves the children of Italy really love their leader, their duce. Children would learn math problems and grammar problems with images of fascism and images that supported that gender binary that I talked about, right? The mother soldier or future mother, future soldier kind of division. So in the classroom, but also outside the classroom, the fascist youth organizations provided all kinds of leisure activities for children. You're looking at young girls on a seaside holiday subsidized by the regime, standing in front of the motto, "Believe, obey, fight," which was the motto of the fascist youth organization. So here too, we see that not only does the attempts of indoctrination begin in childhood, the contradictions do too, because that motto is hardly the kind of motto that you would associate with growing up to be a prolific mother, right? It's more directed at young boys, but it was part of the world experienced by these young girls as well. They are, for the first time, there's a space for them that's not school, that's not home, that's not church, right? They're participating in these activities, they're entering the public sphere, they're being mobilized. And so that we have to kind of consider that in terms of the effect that it might have actually on these young children. Another example of kind of youth leisure pursuits, but also the optics of it, if you will, right? So the goal of mobilizing these bodies as kind of symbols of mass consent, as kind of symbols of this direct connection with the leader. We know, again, what the regime wanted to achieve with this. What we don't know is, what this kid thought about it, because this may, the important thing for that person may have been their ability to participate in these sort of neat activities, just like the fascists benefit from the mediatic moment that they're existing in, that is the new media of film, of radio, etc. They also benefit from changing ideas about pedagogy and about child psychology, so that they can design things that are meant to appeal to children, not just to sort of provide them with lessons. So in the classroom, in their leisure activities, in their leisure reading, these are a couple of magazines designed for the fascist youth, the girls magazine, the Young Italian on the left, and fascist youth magazine on the right. And you can, I think, probably imagine just from the covers, without even reading the captions, that we see this binary reproduced. The young girl in the fascist youth uniform is teaching her kind of messy friend about hygiene, how to keep a clean home, where the fascist youth magazine is full of stories of war and squadrists fighting, fascist squads fighting Bolsheviks and so forth. All things that are designed to inculcate a certain notion of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, but also designed for kids to want to read them, right? Designed to appeal to the mind of youth. And that's, again, being able to take advantage of this particular historical moment. Okay. The last thing I want to say, sorry, I hope I'm not going too long. The last thing I want to say about this particular historical period is to just briefly discuss the role of race, particularly after 1935 or 1936, when victory is declared in Ethiopia, because I think that it behooves us to think about the connection between racism and sexism, or racism and gender. In Italy, we see, as I mentioned, that specific shift after the conquest or the declaration of victory in Ethiopia. We start to see the passage of racial laws in the colonies, anti-miscegenation laws, regulations that establish a racial hierarchy between the Italian colonizer and the colonized. And these laws will eventually travel to the metropole in the form of the 1938 anti-Semitic defense of the race laws in Italy. Now, the timing of that, we can talk about the timing of that in many different ways, but what I want to emphasize here is that it's in 1938 when we get the Manifesto of Italian Racist Scientists, that's what they called themselves, that defines race biologically and asserts the Aryan identity of Italians. So unlike the case with National Socialism or Nazism in Germany, this had not been part of the definition of Italianness. Race was not a specific category of Italianness in the earlier period. But when, I mean, it's not that it wasn't on the radar at all, but it just wasn't sort of a particular component of what the fascists called Italianità. Once it becomes promoted in this way, when you are espousing a particularly racist or explicitly racist ideology, I think it's important to point out that women's bodies become the battleground, or maybe another way to put it is they become the sort of fortress of the race. The image is a magazine cover from the Defense of the Race magazine, which was an actual magazine published in Italy in the 30s. And the cover image is a version of the biblical Old Testament story of Susanna and the elders, in which we have our Aryan Susanna, presumably representing Italy, being lasciviously ogled, and there's an implicit threat here from the elders, who are depicted as an African and a Jew or a Semitic individual. This is, I would say that this kind of message is central to racism, whether it's made explicit or not. The notion that your women, who, remember, are the symbols of your motherland, right, of your nation, are under threat, but also that they are responsible for reproducing a pure nation, right? So the demographic campaign plays in here. And this will become part of the message received by Italians in the years just leading to the war. And I think that we can see this kind of the underlying implications of this sort of sexualized racism mobilized by many right-wing and ethno-nationalist groups today. Just a few thoughts, and maybe more of this will come out in our conversation. A few examples of what I see as paleogenetic nationalism in existence today. My examples are North American and Western European, just because that I'm like most versed in these, but we can find examples from around the world. Paleogenetic nationalism, again, this idea of a historic mission of restoring glory. For me, as an American, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the Make America Great Again campaign of the former President Donald Trump. This resurgent ethno-nationalism with a simultaneous appeal to both religion and calls for violence. You can see on the podium for Trump, the Save America. So we have also this kind of existential crisis that is presented by the right wing in this particular period. The person underneath is Matteo Salvini from the far-right Lega party here in Italy, explicitly anti-immigrant party here in Italy, and he's holding a rosary. So Salvini is someone who makes simultaneous use of calls for the opposition of migration or immigration with violence, and appeals to his own, or like an embrace of his own Christian Catholic identity. And this is, I think, not unusual in many of these movements, this kind of mixing of religion and violence, that I think they, this is a kind of weapon taken from the fascist arsenal. We see the rejection of democratic institutions, even in cases where those democratic institutions were what brought particular movements to power. claims of victimization, even while in power, used to mobilize masses. Again, the evocation of existential crisis. What comes to my mind almost immediately is the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th. I'm sure for all of us, we have our own examples that this kind of setup evokes. We see more often women in the present as far-right representatives, not just symbols, but actual members and spokespeople for far-right organizations. I think that the claims of victimization, even while in power, take on a particular resonance to many followers of these movements when they are made by women. The same is true, again, for that evocation of existential crisis and the rejection of democratic institutions. This is, sorry for so many American examples, but it's been on my mind a lot lately. This is US Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, obviously during COVID times, who, you know, is a representative in Congress, but claims victimhood for herself, right? A person who is not allowed to speak, even though she's a congresswoman on TV all the time. She's definitely allowed to speak. You know, part of this kind of myth of stolen elections, right? This gradual undermining of faith in democratic institutions, faith in a free press, all of these things which create, I mean, faith in the idea of facts themselves, all of these things which create, I think, a really dangerous and volatile situation and breeding ground for these movements. And then finally, just to, sorry, I know I'm talking a long time. Another thing that we see mobilized in current militant nationalism is, in many cases, certainly in the European case, is presenting themselves as the saviors of women. And this can come with or without a side of racism and Islamophobia. This idea that these right-wing groups, because they defend traditional values, because they value the role of women as mothers, as you know, as the caretakers of the hearth, that they are the true defenders of women, and this is often paired, you know, with policies that seek to erode what many women see as their fundamental rights. And then again, the demographic thing, that the reason I wanted to talk about and show you that image from the Defense of the Race magazine, right? The connection between demographic anxieties, racism, and sexism, and the use of women's bodies. So these are two particularly egregious examples. The AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is a far-right party in Germany, which says new Germans will make them ourselves, right? Sort of mobilizing this pregnant woman's body to suggest that the term new Germans, for those of you who don't know, is the way that immigrants who have obtained German citizenship are referred to in Germany. They're the new Germans. And so this idea is that, no, they're not the new Germans, we'll make the new Germans, with this, you know, with the implication that the new Germans will be sort of racially, biologically pure. And then the other one is from a poster and recent Twitter campaign, which is anti-immigrant and explicitly adopts a feminist slogan, right? Adopts it in the service of anti-immigration, and also implies this kind of need both to protect your women and to protect your motherland. And you see a kind of hand reaching out, presumably to grope the United States, reaching out from the direction of Mexico. Mexican border is, of course, where many immigrants, refugees, migrants cross into the U.S. state, the United States territory. And the slogan, no means no, my borders, my choice, which is meant to evoke the feminist slogan, no means no, my body, my choice, right? But turned completely on its head here. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. And apologies for my inability to be as brief as I wanted to be. I'm going to stop the share and happy to take comments or questions.
Thank you very much for that illuminating talk. Many points, very much relevant to our conditions here as well. And you have been pointing out how the right wing in the United States and contemporary right wing in Italy, etc., are asserting some of these fascist lines of propaganda and mobilization, even at current juncture. And we have seen many of those elements, that assertion of extremely hegemonic, macho image of the leader. That strongman idea is very much relevant in our context as well, and how this threat of this manufactured threat of the minorities is being projected as an important aspect. This kind of victimhood that is being projected for the majority in our context. Most of these elements of fascism, and that the Hindu far right in India during the fascist times in Italy, they had close connections. There were visits by the Hindu nationalists to Italy. They have those connections, and some of those values are projected in contemporary politics, and that still becomes part of that extreme nationalism. On the one hand, assertion of masculinity, on the other, and the way gender politics is undertaken in particular manners, so that more liberatory kind of voices could be suppressed to the extent possible by these elements. Even though that could not be done completely, we have seen in our case, women coming to the streets to assert the citizenship rights, when those kinds of legal measures were taken where citizenship itself is being curtailed. We have seen women coming out in a big manner. There are points of resistance in that sense, but thank you very much for pointing out a very significant part of human history where we have to be, fully aware of those realities so that we could get some, very significant political points for confronting our own politics of domination and authoritarianism in our particular context. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think this is the time for discussion, and all the participants are invited to make their own contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Anne, for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
The very interesting recent experience is that we have a parallel situation in Ukraine, where Putin, one of the objectives of his invasion is to ensure denazification. Actually, he wanted to save people from falling into Nazism, for which he had undertaken a military expedition, pushing nearly 3 million people into refugees, or as refugees. A great contradiction in our contemporary times.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there, at least in my opinion, you know, if you read Putin's speech before the invasion, it's full of elements that tap into a particularly Russian historiography, and even the claim that the Ukrainians had fallen into the hands of neo-Nazis or neo-fascists, you know, taps into certain memories of the Red Army's fight with fascism. It certainly taps into, you know, the truth is that there are far-right groups in Ukraine, but also in Belarus, also in, you know, also pretty much everywhere. So I think that contradiction, you know, I think the justification of this war to save the Ukraine from Nazis was in itself kind of self-serving, and maybe an example of the idea of attacking to defend, you know, attacking because you're the real victim, right? So that kind of simultaneous promotion of violence while claiming that that violence is in defense, right? So, but anyway, that's a whole other topic, the disastrous war in Ukraine.
I just can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, this is Latif from Rome. I just wanted to, you know, listening to Dr. An's speech and also what Professor Ramakrishnan commented, it's very interesting to see how fascism is really in a grand international narratives. You know, what happened in Italy in 1920s and the first 2 decades of its history of 20th century is rightly happening in many places, especially in South Asia, in places like Sri Lanka. You know, it's a collapsing state now. We can never devalue, or, you know, what Buddhist radical nationalism did to a very promising country like Sri Lanka, which was really, which could have been a Singapore if it went on with high literacy in 1950s, but it stopped since 1958. But in India, at that time, unlike Sinhalese politicians in India, you have whatever the limitations, Nehru, Congress, secularism, and all. But the last 30 years, you know, it's really almost like repeating. Some of the pictures can be just cut and paste in Indian situation. This is elsewhere, also in Pakistan. But something which I wanted to, a lot of people here are left intellectuals, I understand, from India. But Indian left, especially, I know I don't want to name this person. I think he was a former general secretary of one of the most important left parties in India. Some of these people are not still convinced that, you know, there is a debate going on, like some of the radical nationalist movements, they are really fascist. They are still talking about semantics. So this actually really gives, you know, what you call it, limits our scope of awareness and challenging fascism, especially places like India. So this is one aspect. Then rather than challenging fascism, we still try to see fascism through the classical Marxist or left discourse. So this question is to anybody here, Ramakrishnan or CD, or to you or anybody. So I hope I'm not generalizing. Then like when it comes to issues of minority politics, you know, what makes it difficult for understand and respond the grievances of minorities, whether they are Hindus in Pakistan or Tamil Hindus in Sri Lanka or Muslims in India, elsewhere. So these are 2 or 3 comments and questions, you know. So.
Thank you, Abdel. Should I maybe Dr. Ramakrishnan, you look like you're about to answer, so I'd love to hear that.
Actually, I remember that statement, that hesitancy to talk about the Indian situation as fascist. But we all, I think, agree on the point that if the similarities that we have discussed today, and it is evident from the talk as well, if the situation in India, if it is not fascist in that sense, then what is it? What's the kind of label that we can give? And we are. Everybody wants us. We are on the verge of massive. It's already, many times it has happened, but much more massive kind of, attack on minorities in India. All these situations point towards extreme similarities between the fascist phase in Italy and our own condition here in India. There's no doubt about it. Whatever semantics that has been used for political purposes by leaders.
I mean, I do.
My opinion.
I mean, I do think so. I really, for a very long time, was reluctant to, as a historian, right? I study historical fascism and Italian fascism, and there were debates for many years about like whether fascism could be applied to any movement that wasn't Italy. But I do think that maybe the more helpful for me notion of trying to understand and respond to, and Jasmine asked a question in the chat that maybe will be touched on in this as well, like trying to respond to the dangers of the current moment. It's less about sort of getting bogged down in the question of like, can we call this fascism? Well, it's not fascism because it misses this piece, or it's not fascism because it combines this with this, which the fascists didn't do. I think we get away from the real problem of how to confront and challenge the narratives that are being created by groups that have real detrimental effects on people's lives and livelihoods and existence in some cases. I think that there's certainly, and it also ignores the fact that fascism itself was never coherent as an ideology, right? And I said, Mussolini was an opportunist, and there were lots of direct contradictions within fascism, where he's on record as saying one thing one year and the complete opposite thing a few years later. And so historians of fascism will often have very different ideas about what fascism actually was, depending on which period they study. I think that certainly one of the things that we can do is try to understand the mechanisms by which people like Mussolini in the interwar period, in a period of a particular kind of crisis, which, sorry to get lefty on you, Abdel, was a crisis of capitalism. But the tools and mechanisms that they use to acquire power and maintain power, not in spite of the violence that they committed, but because of it, right? The allies, the people that were willing to align themselves with the fascists for reasons of their own, despite the atrocities that they committed, like understanding how that was possible for them can help us be vigilant against the same techniques tried today. I think that what we have is the old saying that history repeats itself. It's not history that repeats itself, it's human nature that repeats itself, right? And so we understand, how the use of particular kinds of media tools created an aura around particular leaders that allowed them to direct conversations in specific ways and kind of control the discourse, control the narrative, that maybe helps us to look for those tactics applied today. And then I didn't talk about this in my talk because there wasn't time, but what forms of resistance can we find that we can update for our current era? So I mean, that's just my kind of general take on the situation.
Sorry, shall I ask one clarification? Mm-hmm. Wonderful speech. I'm Ravi Raman.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really like the other comments as well, apart from your presentation. It's very good. And you have begun, by asking the question, what really the regime wanted from women. And you have a large number of answers. And as my friends highlighted, all these narratives somehow converge, in the present context, whether you talk about Britain or Germany or India and like that, So some sort of a convergence in narratives taking place. That's one thing that we find. But then actually my clarification is something else. I mean, how would you help us understand the different sort of responses from different regions of Italy to the emergence of fascism? Say, for instance, one would find so much differences between the North and the South. I asked this question specifically because the North was fast industrializing at that time. And the South was, so much embedded in its feudal sort of a system. So I wonder, in what form that people from these two regions responded differentially. What exactly is the kind of lessons that one would learn from this?
Yeah, sure. That's a really excellent question. Thank you, and also a really complex one. The fascism is sort of born in the North, in an area that's rapidly industrializing or had recently rapidly industrialized, and squadrism, the kind of paramilitary turn that fascism takes, is also a phenomenon of kind of North Central Italy, but an area that was not industrialized, but was kind of modernizing its agriculture, right? It was moving from a traditional form of sharecropping agriculture to one which kind of proletarianized the peasants, right? And so instead of living on the land, farming the land, giving half of the produce to the landlord, it was being transformed into a system of cash rents, and that was related to industrialization because the old system didn't produce much capital, and they needed a way for agriculture to produce capital in order to fuel the industrialization in other parts of the country. But its development is located, in its initial phase in the northern regions of Italy, or north and north central Italy, and then spread to some of the larger cities in the south. So Naples and a few of the larger cities in Sicily, but not so much a phenomenon in the countryside outside of that region that's kind of modernizing its old sharecropping system. Once the fascists are in power, they promote a kind of single way of being Italian, a single way of being fascist and Italian, but they promote it to a country that has a long history of regional identities. They have they're trying to transmit a single message, which is received in different ways in different places. The problem is that they, most of their propaganda efforts, most of their organization efforts are, there are large swaths of society that are kind of not left completely outside of it, but they're of less concern to the fascists, right? The mobilization of individuals is of more concern in urban centers, in large population centers, That's where you have the rallies, that's where you have the parades. Their policies towards the rural populations depended, they benefited, you know, they had the battle for grain, another use of like wartime rhetoric for domestic policies, which greatly benefited some regions of Italy and some small landowners in Italy if you were from a region that was capable of producing grain, and greatly damaged others because it destroyed the kind of traditional farming techniques and animal husbandry that was practiced in other areas. So sorry, that's a really long-winded non-answer to your question. I guess the problem is that even as small a country as Italy is, and as small a population as it had in the early 20th century, which was something like 40 million people, I think, 36 million people, I think, and then increased over the 20 years of fascism somewhat. The kind of deeply ingrained regional identities would carry through in the way that people responded to fascism. And it's not even as simple as the difference between the North and the South, although Italian politics is often simplified that way. But even region by region, there were, you know, centers of resistance, and, you know, centers of sort of full-hearted embrace of fascism, places that the fascists paid more attention to, places that they paid less attention to. So I don't really have a good, succinct answer to your question. Just, I suppose, I only made it more complicated. So
no, excellent. Thank you so much. Because I'm a political economist, basically. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted to know more about that connection between the economy and fascism, you know. That's why I thought I would ask that question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I think hand up before.
Should I read, or you can?
I've got the chat pulled up. So one was from Jasmine, which is about what are the ways forward according to you, and I try to touch on that a little bit in my response to Abdel. One of the things that historians are really bad at is talking about the future, unfortunately. And, you know, there's that old saying that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, like the Santayana quote. But often if you know, those that do know their history are doomed to watch others repeat it. So I think that, that what we can do is try to recognize and call out these mechanisms, whether we have to call out a particular group or organization or governments as fascist. I think that's less important than recognizing and unpacking the tactics that are used, right? And so, you know, we have many of these far-right groups or ethno-nationalist groups are responding to aspects of globalization, you know, current crises, and directing people's, you know, seeking power by directing people's dis-ease and anger onto vulnerable populations, right? Rather than directing them, you know, it's very difficult to explain to people or to construct a politics that addresses the problems of globalization, the outsourcing of jobs, mechanization, et cetera, et cetera. It's very easy to point at the body of the migrant as the source of all your suffering, right? And I think that that's a lesson that many of these groups have learned. And so they construct a politics of victimization, giving people an outlet to victimize others, as a kind of outlet for the kind of general discomfort and unease that we have in this current stage of history, where we're moving through, as Abdel Latif said, a very similar, a similar set of circumstances in that, there are dramatic changes happening to the way people live their lives, to the economy, to global connections, to the environment, all of which are overwhelming and require a complex politics, but our mediatic moment rewards only simple answers. And this is a recipe for the ascendancy of the right, who are less scrupulous than the left about giving oversimplified non-answers to complex questions, I think. So
I think there is Professor Mati Quillian. He has been trying to ask question for a while. I can see.
Sure.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just maybe Professor Sidi saw it. Sorry, I can see. Sorry.
Okay. At first, I'm very thankful to Professor Annie for giving a topic in which I am not at all familiar. However, I wish to raise two simple things. One is, as a student of enlightenment, new enlightenment, I think Europe gave the whole world a new light in terms of values like freedom, justice, and the like. But in your presentation, I find Mussolini is giving just the diametric. For example, believe, obey, fight, like that. So there is a clash. And how did the European people, Italian or German, how did they succumb to this sort of a clash?
Yeah.
That is one of my questions. Yeah. The second, and next to it, we know what little I know about Antonio Gramsci and Mussolini. In young days, I think they were friends. That is my assumption. I may be wrong, but however, we know that Mussolini put him in jail for years, and thanks to that, we got the present notebooks from Antonio Gramsci.
Yeah.
So how you react to these two?
So those are also excellent questions and really big ones. I'll try not to be as meandering in my answers to them. About the Enlightenment, I think there are two things at play in Italy. I mean, one is that universal manhood suffrage in Italy was passed in 1913. So there really had been like just a couple elections before, and during the war, elections were suspended. During the First World War, elections were suspended. So the full exercise of political rights for men, women didn't get the vote till after the Second World War, was a new thing, right? And the erosion of the kind of political rights and political participation that happened under the fascists was done in the name of maintaining order, right? Of restoring order. An order that had largely been disrupted because of the fascists, but the left did play its role in the post-war. Many believed in 1919, 1920 that Italy itself was on the verge of a Bolshevik revolution, and the fascists, and like Gramsci, hoped for that as well. But the fascists presented themselves as the people who were going to stop that, and that was enough to make them acceptable to the monarchy, to the old political elite, right, who were appalled by fascist violence, but kind of saw them as a useful tool against a rising red tide, right, with the idea that they would use the fascists to combat the communists, and then once the fascists had defeated the communists, they would control the fascists. Instead, they found themselves controlled by the fascists. And something very similar happens in Germany with National Socialism, right? It's a pattern that gets repeated. I mean, we could analyze the willingness of some traditional elites and conservative political parties to look the other way and make partnerships with groups that are thuggish at best, right? In the name of kind of defeating what they perceive as their more important political enemies. So there's that. The other thing is that the fascists one of the things they say about their movement, they promote it as a third way between liberal democracy and communism. They reject a number of the things that I would consider hallmarks of the Enlightenment, the institutions that I mentioned in my talk, separation of powers, et cetera, free judiciary, freedom of speech, all of these things. But they keep the idea of the common will, like it's very Rousseauian in a certain sense, right? They keep this idea that there is the will of the people. They insist that they rule at the will of the people, even though there are no elections. There's none of the traditional institutions, or what I think of as the institutions that demonstrate the will of the people. It's the leader, right, who channels this will. So they draw a line between themselves and the Enlightenment and present themselves as a group that's gone beyond parliamentary politics, gone beyond, this idea of just collecting individual votes, which they dismiss as not really reflective of a collective will, to this idea that the charismatic leader can channel that will, right? And there were intellectuals that were convinced by that argument at the time, right? So they see themselves as taking a different path of the Enlightenment. We should remember that was always, however, something that we're willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of power, right? That was, the ideology of fascism is something that, is also very opportunistic, let's say. Gramsci and Mussolini, I don't know that they were necessarily close friends, but Mussolini was, he began his political life as a member of the Italian Socialist Party. He was a socialist as a young man, protested the Libyan war, was anti-monarchical, was anti-clerical, all of that. He breaks with the Socialist Party over intervention in the First World War. Italy doesn't enter the First World War until a bit later than the main belligerents. And Mussolini begins to advocate for that fairly early on. He sees the war as having revolutionary potential, is his first approach. But he's expelled from the Socialist Party because of that. They become enemies at that point. Gramsci was a bit younger, so I'm not sure how closely the two worked, but certainly people like Turati and Mussolini knew each other very well. During the war and just after the First World War, when fascism was founded, they did have a platform that contained demands that were inspired by this kind of left background, but they didn't get any votes with that platform. And so what we saw is the first major sacrifice of ideology in pursuit of power, when Mussolini decided to basically scrap the kind of left-wing language or demands, ramp up the nationalism, insist on the revivifying power of violence, and it's with that platform that he began to gain followers. Imprisoning Gramsci, Gramsci broke with the Socialist Party to form the Italian Communist Party in 2021, and the communists were the first group that the fascists rounded up as they were transforming their regime into a dictatorship. And so he was in prison and also badly beaten on many occasions, and ultimately died of injuries sustained and poor health from his years of imprisonment. Okay, I didn't succeed in being shorter, maybe a little shorter, but I hope that answered your questions.
We have two more questions in the chat box.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So Mohit Abral, I hope I said your name right. In many Eastern European countries, including Ukraine and Baltic states, memory, victimhood under Soviet occupation, Central World War II experience, and ethno-cultural nationalism plays a significant role in identifying identity and citizenship. What role women are playing in preserving memories and constructing cultural nationalism of neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic type, given many far-right parties? Yeah, I mean, this is a problem. This is a problem in not just in Ukraine and the Baltic states, right, which do have histories. I mean, even during the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, going through, well, actually, moving out of Poland and going through the Baltic states, which had been established after the First World War, which had been part of the Russian Empire, but weren't part of the Soviet Union. The Nazis met many willing collaborators on their invasion into the Soviet Union. Like many people who saw Hitler as a better choice than Stalin. There's no hiding that. There were lots of Nazi collaborators during the war itself. There were lots of collaborators in those countries in the Shoah, in the identification and rounding up of Jews for extermination. That's definitely a part of the past. One that many people in those countries, particularly in the post-World War II period under the Soviets, did not fully come to grips with, because the narrative in the Soviet Union of the Second World War was a narrative of the defeat of Nazism, but that Nazism was the kind of extreme form of the last gasp of industrial capitalism, and that its target was the working class, right? So the racial aspects of Nazi targets were downplayed in some Soviet historiography, at least in the early years. When the Soviet Union broke up and many of the former Soviet republics and states reasserted their independence, yes, it's absolutely true that the national identity construction in the post-Soviet period was influenced at times, not exclusively, but influenced by many far-right groups. There's no question. There's an affinity between a certain kind of nationalism and far-right groups. That said, those groups exist also in Western Europe. They exist in other places that weren't part of the Soviet Union, that assert a particular kind of identity construction in those places, that is very often includes like an apology in the sense of not a saying sorry, but like a giving of excuses for Nazism. And it's difficult to know sort of the degree to power of power, like how to compare the power of those groups in Central and Eastern Europe as opposed to outside there. So, I mean, I do think that it's not, it is the case that there is that history and that those groups exist, and that very often nationalism is most, in those places is most strongly embraced by those particular kinds of groups. But I don't think that we can dismiss those states and their national identities as purely products of neo-Nazism. So I hope that is clear enough about that question. Oh, you asked the role of women in particular. I mean, I think it's very similar to the kinds of things that I was trying to talk about in the talk, right? So women as symbols of purity, of symbols of the kind of ethnic future of a particular nation, and also as symbols of like the potential victimhood awaiting them if the country doesn't maintain its pure roots. I think that's a kind of standard symbolic representation in many of these groups. And then Dr. Sen says, the term fascist in the political parlance here is a very powerful epithet. Yeah, here too. Little attention is paid to actual realities on the ground. The main point is that how to counteract the right-wing mass movements while riding and also when in power, out to wipe out all traces of egalitarianism, pluralism, and democracy, how to counter. I wish I had the answer to that question, right? That seems to me to be, the big question for our times, really. And I think we have to really recognize the power of the narratives that they construct, and to construct our own counter narratives to that. I mean, one of the things that the fascists were, historically were very good at, and one of the things that these fascistoid, let's say, new groups are also very good at, is creating a narrative that is bulletproof, right? That, they offer a kind of mythology, but mythology not in the sense of it being untrue, but in the sense of it being an explanation for the world, right? A worldview that has an answer for everything. And once you embrace that, individual pieces of counter evidence can't penetrate, right? And so, the fascists would use like deliberate absurdities in their slogans and their propaganda, because the minute you start to debate an absurd statement, you've lost, right? You can't combat the irrational with the rational. And I think that the one thing that those who oppose these kinds of movements, who believe in egalitarianism and pluralism and multiculturalism and democracy can do, is, we can't piecemeal try to reason through the individual claims. We have to construct our own compelling counter narratives. And I don't mean invent or make up or falsify, but we have to get good at explaining why those things are valuable, right? We have to get good at explaining why our vision that includes these things is superior, frankly, to a vision that is exclusive and embattled and always, victimized. Like we have to have our own metaphors to challenge those that characterize these movements. How to do that?
So Michael Taragan wants to ask.
My name is Michael Tarakan. I'm a student of history.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, even if we keep the questions of semantics and terminology apart, don't we have to take into account the differences in historical context? For instance, your own presentation gave the impression, and the correct impression, that the Italian fascist forces came to power within a very short period of time. While in a country like India, where almost everybody attributes the fascist intentions to one organization, and that organization is nearly 100 years old, and that had to live through movement for freedom, democratic institutions of 60 or 70 years vintage, the strong influence of Gandhism. One can go on repeating what was happening in it. And even if we attribute them to be aiming at instituting a fascist rule, they are not yet reached that stage where they can claim to have done that. Now, since you are asking the question, the lessons that we have to learn, can one completely accept the gender politics that was practiced in Italy in the 1920s and the 30s as relevant to India, where all new set of questions are being faced by not only the society, but also by the women in this country. I was only wondering about that.
Sure. I feel like there are probably others here who are better equipped to answer the questions about the specific Indian situation. I mean, I follow, but I don't know that I am the best person to speak to that. I can say that I don't think we can fully apply the Italian situation in the 1920s to really anywhere else today or any other time. There is a kind of a perfect storm, if you will, of influences that include a certain stage of political development, of industrial development, a certain an arrival on the scene and of mediatic technologies that make new things possible, and that someone like Mussolini is very quick to recognize the potential of film, of radio, not just as a way to get the same kind of message out to more people or in a different way, but as fundamentally changing the relationship between the receiver of a message and the giver of a message, right? So that's an example. We might use that to think about the use of social media today or other kinds of tools. I mean, I think we can use it to give us a framework, but we certainly, we're not going to see and haven't seen, as you say, in such a rapid period, that same set of circumstances again. I think what we can, what we can recognize is the lessons of how people respond to crises, how people can be manipulated in their beliefs, or how people can be co-opted into choosing a path that they see as having advantages for them. Because there's that too. It's not all stick, right? Or smoke and mirrors. There's also, incentives for people. People embrace fascism for a variety of reasons. So no, I don't think it's a question of being able to directly apply one case to another. I think it's a question of trying to understand the way that the many iterations of human response to groupings of crises and how that has been directed and manipulated over time, which is then got to be reinterpreted and reapplied to our own specific set of circumstances. And maybe we need to look at sort of multiple fascist paths and look for the common threads in order to get a better handle on what's going on, not just in India, but in many places around the world. So again, not a very satisfying answer, I'm sure, but I take your point. I don't think we can just kind of pick up the frame of 1920s Italy and set it down where we want. People do that sometimes, right? They, it's like, oh, this person is Mussolini, right? Because it's, it's a simplified way of trying to shorthand, a whole set of complex feelings about a particular person, a particular ideology, a particular set of practices, but it doesn't get us very far. Yeah, it gets us, it becomes a loaded, epithet that we can hurl at our political opponents, but it doesn't get us any further than that.
Thank you very much for this answer, as well as your initial presentation, which was excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. I was super nervous.
Siti,
I think it's almost.
I'm sorry, I've kept you guys from your dinners, probably.
No. I think the discussion has been very fruitful and enlightening. I think we can wind up having listened to a very enlightening lecture and also very enlightening discussion. And I will request Samir. Ramakrishnan, do you want to say anything more?
No, just to add to the point that Michael was raising, and the response to that as well. The historic specificities of these situations, I completely agree. But on one point, that in a kind of world that we live in, with the media, with political ideologies that that not only exhibit similarities but share ideas, I think there should be some, analytical space for how historical specificities come into that intersection between what's happening at the global level at this point of time. Because these histories are now being made in that kind of an interactive manner as well, and that's the history of recent history of neoliberal economic transformation as well, and contemporary capitalism for that matter, and so on and so forth. So that's a very valid point, but there is also some way of, understanding politics globally that becomes very, very significant at this point of time as well, I think.
Absolutely.
Now I'll request our secretary, BMMRC, Samir Munir, to conclude.
Good evening. We have had an insightful and thought-provoking talk by Dr. Anne on women in times of fascism in Italy, and also the lessons that the contemporary world must take from those times. Thank you, Dr. Anne, for your willingness to deliver this lecture. And we at the BMMRC hope to continue our association with you in the near future.
Thank you very much. This was very enjoyable, and like I said, it was so interesting to hear perspectives from colleagues in India. So and in Dubai, I believe, is where you are. So yeah. So okay. So yes, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. I appreciate the attention. So.
Okay, thanks. Professor Ramakrishnan, who chaired the session, happens to be a member of the governing body of the BMMRC. Still, I take the liberty to thank him for chairing the session on behalf of BMMRC and all those who are present here. Also, we have had an eminent list of attendees who made this program very lively and who kept on asking questions, and it was really an interactive session. Thank you all. So it's time to leave right now. Till we meet next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ravi. Ramgi.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Latif.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's all quite enlightening to talk to you all. BMRC is really something very refreshing intellectually. Look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.